Hello everyone and thank you for tuning into TradeChat. My name's Panzer and today I'm going to be talking about the changes coming for Death Knights in patch 7.0. I hope that you enjoy this video, and if you do, remember to rate it thumbs up. The most immediately noticeable difference for Death Knights in patch 7.0 is the overhaul of the rune system. There are no longer 3 separate types of runes. Instead, there are 6 unified runes with a maximum of 3 regenerating at any given time. In addition to the removal of Blood, Frost, and Unholy runes, Blood, Frost, and Unholy presents have also been removed. Another thing to keep in mind when looking at any class really is that Draenor perks and major glyphs have been removed. A lot of the functionalities and modifiers provided by glyphs and perks have been baked directly into talents and abilities. Minor glyphs still exist, but they're not the same as they used to be. They're no longer applied in a glyph interface, and there's no longer a limit of 3 minor glyphs. Some minor glyphs are still in glyph form, but they're applied directly to the spell in your spellbook. Some are class-specific toys, and some are even abilities that appear in your spellbook, like Corpse Explosion. There is still a limit of 1 minor glyph per spell. The biggest focus for class changes in patch 7.0 was to reinforce the fantasy of what it is to be each spec. This means that Blizzard has reduced a lot of ability overlap. To further define and reinforce what it is to be the fantasy of each Death Knight spec, each of the 3 specs were given a single disease with a unique trait, as well as a talent tree that was largely populated with specialization-specific talents. In addition to that, each spec also got their own unique PvP talent tree, and I'm not going to go over all of the talents from each of those 6 trees and compare them to the 3 trees that are live now because the video would just be too long, but I would highly recommend checking out Wowhead's talent calculator for both PvE and PvP talents, which I have linked for you in the info below. All specs of Death Knight will be able to use the new ability called Wraith Walk. Wraith Walk will break root effects and increase movement speed by 70% for 2 seconds. During this time, movement and pairing effects are suppressed, but the Death Knight cannot attack. Now with this change, On a Pale Horse will no longer reduce the duration of movement slowing effects, it will only increase the Death Knight's movement speed by 20%. Blood Death Knight's fantasy focuses on the sinister command of blood and bone to increase survivability. Most of their core abilities have only been slightly changed in 7.0 to provide clarity to the spec. In Legion, Blood Death Knight's artifact weapon will be a 2-handed axe called Maw of the Damned. Blood Death Knight's disease is Blood Plague, which inflicts the enemy with shadow damage while also healing the Death Knight for 1% of their maximum health every 3 seconds for 24 seconds. By default, Blood Boil and a new ability called Death's Caress will apply Blood Plague. Death Strike now costs runic power instead of runes. Also, instead of rune tap, Bone Shield is the primary complement for Death Strike for active defenses. This better ties into the fantasy of what it is to be a Blood Death Knight and also provides the player with more flexibility. Marrow End is a new ability which Blood Death Knights will use to rotationally generate bone shields. Also, to provide gameplay contention using runes of a single type, Blood Strike will now generate additional runic power on top of the standard amount gained for spending a rune. Frost Death Knight's fantasy focuses on inflicting a deadly cold upon their enemies. The biggest change for most Frost Death Knights in Legion will be the mandatory dual wielding. Instead of having 1 artifact weapon, they will have 2 one-handed swords known as Icebringer and Frost Reaper, which are together known as the Blades of the Fallen Prince. Frost Death Knight's disease is Frost Fever, which deals frost damage to the enemy and has a chance to grant 5 runic power to the Death Knight every 3 seconds for 30 seconds. By default, Howling Blast applies Frost Fever. Another change worth noting for Frost DKs is that Killing Machine's passive will now only affect Obliterate. In Legion, since there are no raid-wide buffs, Horn of Winter has been completely overhauled. It is usable only by Frost Death Knights and is a talented ability with a 30-second cooldown that generates 1 rune and 5 runic power. Unholy Death Knight's fantasy focuses on unleashing disease and undead minions on their enemies. They are probably receiving the most changes out of the 3 specs of Death Knight in 7.0. In Legion, Unholy Death Knight's artifact weapon will be a 2-handed sword called Apocalypse. Unholy Death Knight's disease is called Virulent Plague. It deals moderate shadow damage every 3 seconds for 21 seconds. When Virulent Plague expires, it erupts, dealing moderate shadow damage split evenly between all nearby enemies. Virulent Plague has a 30% chance to erupt every time it deals damage. By default, Outbreak will apply Virulent Plague. Outbreak, by the way, has been completely overhauled. It now deals 38% of your attack power as shadow damage surrounding the target in a miasma for 6 seconds that applies Virulent Plague. Festering Strike has lost its luster over time, and it's been reworked to include a new mechanic called Festering Wound. Festering Strike will deal massive physical damage and also inflict the target with 1 to 3 Festering Wounds. Festering Wounds will burst when the player uses Scourge Strike or when the infected target dies. This will deal moderate shadow damage and regenerate 3 runic power. Just to quickly recap what we talked about in this video, Death Knights will no longer have Blood, Frost, and Unholy runes. They will instead have 6 unified runes with a maximum of 3 regenerating at any given time. There will also no longer be Blood, Frost, and Unholy presences. Important notes about Death Strike for Blood Death Knights: it now costs runic power instead of runes, and its complement is Bone Shield instead of Rune Tap. Frost Death Knights will need to get used to dual wielding because they have no choice, and also Killing Machine will now only affect Obliterate. Unholy Death Knights are receiving the most changes with a heavy focus on their new disease, as well as pulling minions from the ground and sicking them on their attackers. This was obviously a very TLDR version of everything that's happening to Death Knights in 7.0 and Legion. If you are serious about your spec and your class, I would highly recommend checking out the links that I have in the information below, or even better, logging onto the PTR and experiencing it a little bit firsthand. But I do hope that you liked this video. I hope that you found it a little bit helpful. If you did, make sure that you thumb it up and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. Leave me a comment in the comment section below. Tell me what kind of Death Knight that you play and if you are looking forward to the changes or not. I am gonna go. I hope you're all having a wonderful day. I love you all. You're in my hearts. I'll see you soon. Goodbye. Goodbye. Goodbye.